Palestine as revealing a fundamental truth about our economy, which is that what is good for people is usually bad for the economy and vice versa.
A lot of liberals, especially in the US, they're always surprised. They're surprised that there are, fascist tendencies in the US government. They're surprised there's a lot of inequality going all around the world. They're surprised that there's ethnic cleansing and genocide going on in Palestine. But if you understand the framework, if you understand that Israel is a settler colonial state whose aim has always been to push Palestinians out of the land, then you're not surprised.
We today want to look at Palestine because Palestine really represents a microcosm that kind of can highlight in an even more violent way what is this more general condition of our capitalist economy. Welcome everybody to FREE, the Forum for Real Economic Emancipation podcast. I'm Clara Mattei, Professor of Economics and author of The Capital Order, your host. We are here today to confront from a different angle what is the most devastating topic of our time. We are at the 664th day of genocide as of August 1st, the apex of what has been the intentional destruction of an entire population. Indeed, it's the moment of most catastrophic phase of famine. The starvation campaign doesn't stop. People are being targeted at the distribution points, and hundreds are dying every day of acute malnutrition. This is a topic that the Western media has only recently started actually seeing. And we want to discuss today how part of what is unseen is the economic dimension of subordination that has a long history, and how this economic dimension of subordination actually very much helps us today make sense of what is happening in that region. Indeed, what is most devastating to me as a mother is the fact that the only way to maintain our sanity in this historical moment is to look away, is to give up our humanity and pretend this is not happening, because the images of the starving children otherwise would not let us be functional. This is something that is a strategy that we need to fight against. We can't just look away. And looking away has been a strategy that has been diffused in the Western world, not just about the genocide, but the way in which we discuss the deep economic troubles that the majority of the population in this globe faces. 7 out of the 8 billion people on the planet live in the global south and experience what is ultimately extraction of resources that systemically get channeled for the development of the global north. These are all topics that deserve our attention more than ever today. This is why we have with us a very, very special guest, Professor Ibrahim Shikaki, who is Associate Professor of Economics at Trinity College in Connecticut, and an alum where he received his PhD at the New School for Social Research, where I taught for many years. Ibrahim is also professor at the IUC, the International University College of Turin, and at Bizarrate University in the West Bank. We are here together to really dig into Ibrahim's special research topic. He's an expert on the political economy of Palestine, on the economic development, and in general of the macroeconomics of inequality. Thank you so much, Ibrahim, for being with us.
Thank you, Clara. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's dig right into it, Ibra. Sorry, I call you Ibra because you're a long-term friend, but I must say that the amount of knowledge I learned from you is rare. You're one of the people that most inspires me in my daily work. So I get to call you Ibra even if you are fully Professor Shikaki. So let's discuss. You have a wonderful piece called Weaponizing Economics Against Palestine that just came out on the Rosa Luxemburg blog, in which you really problematize economics as a discipline in its social role of mystification, of hiding what really matters. So I think today especially because we are at Free, the Forum for Real Economic Emancipation tells us, well, in order to actually transform this society that is clearly inhuman, we need more courageous conceptual tools. And this is why we need to approach and discover what are these traditions that are usually left at the margins, but are speaking to us so much about current conundrums society faces. The first one is development. The story we hear is the fact that ultimately, if any country was able to implement those very efficient market institutions that the global north has perfected, then we would be in a path of upward growth and progress for everyone on the planet. So this idea that it's ultimately the responsibility of the people and the responsibility of the institutions in Africa, in Palestine, and everywhere in the world to do better for themselves. How is this something that we can counteract with a different framework, that of dependency theory that you studied so well, that actually tells us the opposite, tells us that the global north is rich exactly because the global south suffers from permanent exploitation and extraction?
Yeah, that's a great question, Clara, and Ibra is completely fine. I think, thinking about the mainstream approach to development, it is simplistic. It's linear. It's stagist. All it says is what's going to happen is some sort of convergence, right? So this notion of convergence theory, there will be positive spillovers. And so some of the academic work that we know of, kind of in that very interesting book called Kicking Away the Ladder, I think, gives us an idea that a lot of these advanced countries today, the type of policies that they implemented are very much different than the types of policies they're trying to enforce on a lot of developing countries. And so, yes, this notion of dependency, I think, tackles that a little bit. Dependency says that when you do have a strong economy that we call the core, and then a poor economy that we call the periphery, when you have economic relations between them, what happens is not convergence, what the mainstream tells us. What happens is not positive spillovers, but what happens is actually the opposite. So rich countries become richer and poor countries become poorer, right? So what happens is more of a divergence and countries being locked. Now, why does that happen? There's a lot of different schools of thought, if you want. But I think the main thing that we talk about is that our economic system is inherently unequal, that uneven development is inherent in our economic system. And part of that has to do with where capital and where labor are concentrated. Part of that has to do with what are the high value added and low value added of goods that are produced in different places. So I think in the Palestinian context, this is very important because the dependency relationship is the economic byproduct of settler colonialism, right? So I don't think settler colonialism and dependency are mutually exclusive. Settler colonialism is the ultimate Zionist project. It is to replace the people on that land, to displace the people on that land. What happens is the economic byproduct of that is that state of dependency, the different types of movements that happen between the strong and the weak economy. And as a result, what happens is those strong economies become stronger and the poor economies are kind of locked in a situation that they are at.
Thank you. So really what we see here is that the idea of separating economics from the political, the law, the institution makes no sense. It's a way to, again, hide what really matters. So this relations of dependency that ultimately mean that today much more resources are being channeled out of the global south in favor of the global north, including interest on debt, so money coming out because of debt, but also profits being reshored by big corporation and natural resources. We today want to look at Palestine because Palestine really represents a microcosm that kind of can highlight in an even more violent way what is this more general condition of our capitalist economy. So why is it that this relation between Israel and the Palestinian territories speaks so clearly of this structural violence that so many people in the globe have to face? So perhaps, Ibra, we could go through the phases of this construction, again, political construction of economic dependency, and the ways in which indeed the Palestinian economy has been morphed to serve the accumulation of wealth in Israel and other countries of the global north. So maybe we could look at, for example, the early stages, going back all the way to the British Mandate, and how indeed the historical lens is so powerful because it lets us question what we normalize today. So why don't we dig into this historical excursus that can let us problematize what we normally take for granted, starting from the colonial moment of the British intervention in the region?
So I think that's very important, kind of understanding Palestine, Israel as that microcosm of the global north, global south dynamic. I think, yes, this is an interesting way of looking at it, not just as scholars and researchers, but I think this was also clear from the early days from Israeli officials themselves. The Israeli ambassador, actually, in the UN, and later he was the deputy prime minister, mentioned on the floor of the UN that Israel seeks to emulate the relationship that the US has with other Latin American countries. The wording exactly was, we want our relationship with the Palestinians and the Arab world to be akin to that of the US with Latin American countries. So you can see that early on, really, in terms of the intentions and how Israel saw itself as an extension of the West, as an extension of European settler colonialism. I think those relationships in a simplified way are two sets of movement. So on the one hand, you see the movement of natural resources, human resources, land, labor, water, minerals, from that periphery, the poor economy, the global south to the global north. And on the other side, you see finalized good, particularly high value added goods moving the other way around. Obviously, this is kind of historically what has been the case, but you're absolutely right. What happened as well is that we also have a financial dependency ensuing. Now, the question, which is the second part that we're discussing, is, well, how is it that Israel became this core economy? In that dependency relationship between the Palestinian and the Israeli economy, how did the Israeli economy become this core, strong economy, advanced economy? And you're absolutely right. You can't answer that looking only at the last 10, 20 years. I think really understanding this, you have to understand the early Zionist organizations who were operating in historical Palestine even before the creation of the State of Israel. So a lot of these organizations distorted markets for labor, created markets for land that did not exist there anymore, and made sure that any capital that was going to Palestine was specified for Zionist organizations only in Zionist production. So this starts with the Zionist organizations operating in Palestine in the late 19th century and early 20th century. But perhaps the most important 20, 25 years that you see is the time of the British Mandate. So after World War I, really the British Mandate starts technically in 1922. And from 1922, really until the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, that time led to a huge shift in the weight, not only of the Jewish population in Palestine, for sure. I mean, Article 6 of the British Mandate says that the role of the British Mandate in Palestine is to encourage Jewish immigration, but really kind of shifting the weight of production, shifting the weight of industrial production. And it happened through direct policies. So, the British gave very important concessions for Zionist organizations and groups, the first electricity company, potash company, salt companies, which were very important actually for the Palestinian Arab production there. But they also changed the way that they collect taxes. This was very important later for what happened to labor. So monetizing taxes instead of it being in kind. So a lot of Palestinians used to work in agriculture and they used to pay taxes in kind. And now they had to pay it in money, which a lot of times put these Palestinians in debt and kind of force them economically outside of their land. And they also played a lot around with tariffs to make sure that these Jewish industries would basically benefit. So you have all of this going before the establishment of the State of Israel. In 1948, when the State of Israel is established, this happens while 700 to 800,000 Palestinians who lived in what would later become the State of Israel became refugees. 70 to 80 massacres, documented massacres, happened during that time. And you had hundreds of villages, including where my grandfather is, Zarnuqa, which is south of Ramle, completely destroyed. And the majority of those Palestinians had to either go to Gaza, where 80% of the people who live in Gaza are original refugees, or the West Bank, Syria, and Lebanon. There's a very small percentage, around 20-25%, that remained in Israel proper, and these are Palestinians now who live in the State of Israel and who also face different types of racism and discrimination. So again, all of this happens before, as you mentioned, 1967, which is normally when people start. In 1967, Israel occupied the rest of historical Palestine, the remaining 22% of historical Palestine, which is the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. And from then, a lot of the economic, analysis and kind of more direct discussion about labor and dependency starts. But you have to go back to understand, how is it that we got to that point in the 1960s where Israel became this core economy that started interacting with the Palestinian one?
Absolutely. So this is crucial to see the different phases in which basically what happens is the substitution of a subsistence-based economy that was mostly agricultural. Almost half of the population was still working in agriculture in before 1967, to ultimately a dependent economy in which agriculture and manufacture is largely substituted by financial services serving the Israeli economy, is ultimately the outcome of this relation of dependency that starts, Ibra, as you were mentioning, with the commodification of land, with the fact that from subsistence we go to subsistence labor, we go to wage labor, right? This very big shift on the conditions of the majority, who can no longer access their means of subsistence through, picking fruits from the trees and growing olive trees and exchanging the subsistence economy, but rather it becomes about finding ways to get money in your pocket in order to buy goods that someone else produces and you purchase. And so this change from subsistence economy to market dependence, I think is a very long process, right? And you say it starts during the British Mandate, but then escalates during the occupation of 1967, again, in which basically Israel then controls the budget of the Palestinian territory. The currency is now the Israeli currency, substituting local currency, and also all of the banks are closed and put under Israeli control. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about this shift from the occupation of 1967 and all these orders that regulate the Palestinian economy to then the Paris Protocol, which comes with the Oslo Accord of 1994, which again formalizes this economic dependency. So what are key elements of this period from 1967 to 1994 and to today that show how this dependency becomes even more entrenched in the way the economy runs?
I think this is an important question, and probably a good answer that I'm going to attempt really kind of summarizes how you can understand whatever we call the Palestinian economy today. And I think there are like 4 or 5 points that are relevant for this. So the first 2 points are those dependencies that we talked about up until 1994. When Israel occupied the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and I mentioned including East Jerusalem a lot of times because some people believe that Israel occupied Jerusalem as part of the establishment of the State of Israel. Only West Jerusalem was part of the establishment of the State of Israel. East Jerusalem was occupied after 1967. Now, a few years later, Israel decided to annex East Jerusalem under the unified Jerusalem as a capital of the State of Israel. But East Jerusalem is, under international law, as well occupied, considered occupied territories. The first thing that it did was implement military policy, right? So you go and you occupy these lands. And there was a lot of conversation between Israeli leaders. You know, the one that is most discussed is between Ben Gurion and Moshe Dayan. And so they were discussing, should we annex these parts? They didn't want that idea because, unlike in 1948, Palestinians remained there, right? So they didn't go to Gaza or to Jordan, and they had a demographic issue to deal with. Ben Gurion discusses this. I mean, he talks about how we should have Jewish women have up to 8 children per woman so we can increase the population. So there was discussion, should we annex, should we not annex? In the end, the point was we will not annex this. But as some very early report by the Israelis said, we can use this territory as, and this is a quote again, as a supplementary market and a resource for factors of production, including unskilled labor. So it's very clear, this is early 1970s, kind of spelling out that dependency relationship. So you had these military orders. Some of the first few early military orders were economic in nature, as you mentioned. We closed down all the banks. We put a lot of restrictions on industry, and we continue, obviously, confiscating more and more land, whether it's for security reasons, for settlement reasons. They have 6 or 7 different types of reasons, including environmental reasons, of why they would confiscate all of these lands. And so what starts to happen is, domestically, there is very little opportunity. There's very little employment opportunities being created. With that, you have the confiscation of land. And so these people who had a factor of production, who had some sort of capital in their land, and now, you know, they only have their labor to sell, which means you have the transformation that you mentioned. These people who are self-employed in agriculture now don't have that opportunity. They only have their labor to sell, and they end up, the vast majority of them end up working in the Israeli construction sector. So this happens dramatically in the first 20 years of the occupation. So between 1967, when 0% of Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza were working in Israel, to 1987, 20 years, 40% of Palestinian labor was now working in the Israeli economy. Now, that provided, if you want, some sort of individual benefit for people who are working there. Put aside everything politically, that you're working for your occupier, that you were working for your colonizer, right? Israeli writers were saying, look how we're helping these Palestinians. We're providing income for them. But a lot of people, as early as that, were talking about how what this meant collectively was the demise of any possible solution for a possible outcome of a viable Palestinian economy. Why? The main reason was because of all the restriction on the productive capacity, the income that would come through Palestinian work would eventually find its way back to the Israeli economy. And so what happened because of this dependency, not only on the Israeli labor market, but also on the Israeli goods market. And so to the extent that 70 to 80% of all Palestinian imports and exports were with the Israeli economy. So you have a dependency on the labor market, a dependency on the goods market and trade, to the extent where Israel, A, benefits from this plunder of natural resources, B, benefits from the exploitation of this cheap labor, and C, has an extra market if it needed, especially early on, if it needed to dump any goods. On the other hand, Palestinians would have a skyrocketing trade deficit. Their productive sector is completely demised, but what would also happen was that they would be locked in this situation.
So you raised the issue of labor, and I think this is very important because that actually shows how dependency theory, which is the approach that we're using to explain these deep, deep problems, cannot avoid having a class analysis dimension to it. And in your work, you actually show how the fact that cheap Palestinian labor was working in Israel helped pacify the class struggle in Israel itself. So how Israeli workers were losing from the subjugation of Palestinian workers. So can we maybe develop this concept a little bit more, given that it's so crucial for this initial phase of the occupation, and it grows really until the 80s with the first Intifada, and then something changes there in terms of how many Palestinians are actually hired in Israel. And we can get into that maybe right after.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So think about this. You're an Israeli employer, right? What is the use of this Palestinian, reserve army of labor or unemployed? So the one hand is very direct. These people, you would pay them less than you would pay Israeli workers. For a variety of reasons, wages of Palestinians were much lower. And so you would pay them less. That means if you are thinking about the profit wage kind of frontier, then you are increasing your profits. I think B is just not necessarily just the wage, but having kind of, I mean, this is, I think, the dream of any employer, that you can have this, expendable workforce. Whenever you want, you can close the faucet, right? We're going through an expansion. We need more labor. How can we get more labor without necessarily needing to increase wages? Because that's normally what would happen. And on the other way, if you're going through an economic recession, how can you make sure that you get rid of labor without necessarily needing to go through legal aspects and try to give workers their rights? So that was the first two, but you're absolutely right. The third is you can use this. And so there are a lot of people who wrote about the political aspects of full employment. Full employment is actually not very good, because when you have full employment, you give more bargaining power to labor. And so what happened is the Palestinians became kind of the way to discipline, in one sense, these Israeli workers. And so they tell them, hey, if you don't like work, we have these Palestinians who can go there and who can work for less. But on the other hand, this is the dualism of it. On the other hand, it actually did lead to Israeli workers being able to climb a little bit that social ladder, right? Israeli employers were able maybe to increase wages as their productivity and profit increased, because they had this group of Palestinian workers that they did not need to increase their wages, or that they could make sure to get rid of whenever they wanted. So there are a lot of political economy aspects that relationship between capital and labor is very interesting. I don't think it necessarily goes only in one way, but Palestinian labor has been used both to pacify that tension between capital and labor, but also discipline Israeli labor. So I think that's very important. Like you mentioned, at least up until the 1990s, when we're talking about the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, but those dependencies, both on the labor market and the goods market, up until then, were kind of the main way of understanding what economic dynamics existed there. Maybe the only final part on that before we can discuss the PA is that it's not just work in Israel, right? I mean, that number 40% also, Clara, is an understatement. That does not include a lot of the smuggled Palestinian labor who didn't have specific permits or who didn't apply in labor offices. So that is underestimated. But then you also had work in the domestic economy that was working for Israel. One of the first jobs I had was actually working in a pillow workshop in Tulkarem, where I'm from. And that was a subcontractor for an Israeli firm. So they would bring the material, they would hire Palestinian labor, and then every end of the week, we would send back the finalized material to Israel.
I want to go back to a point you mentioned. You say full employment is not very good. It's important to qualify that what you're specifically saying is that it's not very good in a capitalist economy, because of course it's good for people to have a job, but for our system, if you're not able to keep these people in check, then people would probably not accept their condition as wage workers, right? So in a critical economics, we understand that the value that actually is the source of wealth is economic growth, as we quantify it, actually comes out of a very specific social relation, which is that between worker and employer. And this relationship is, by definition, a power relation of subjugation that is based on the fact that the worker is producing much more value than what he or she gets in the paycheck. So this relation of subjugation that is at the core of how value is produced under capitalism requires constant protection. And unemployment serves a crucial role, because if people could have options to live differently, they would probably go for it. And this is why ultimately the seizing and privatizing of land is at the foundation of all of this, because again, people are left with no alternative but to go work exploited in Israel, for example. And of course, the Palestinian workers are the most surveilled in the world. So they have to pass checkpoints. They are basically like inmates that have a very little amount of time they can actually spend in Israel, having to go back, otherwise being heavily prosecuted. So it's very interesting that it's a pool of employable people that makes sure that no one has enough liberty to change what they do, because otherwise they get substituted. And this pool of employable people is super exploitable because of these conditions of political subordination, the fact that they're not all equal citizens. There is a very, very big difference between who you're employing. So I think this is really important. And what about when Palestinians stand up for themselves? Why is the first Intifada so important? To understand also why Israel has decided to also try to find other super exploitable people from the Philippines, from other countries of the global south, so as to create competition for the work. What happened with the first Intifada? What was it about? It was about labor ultimately at its very core at the beginning, right?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And yes, to your point, absolutely, full employment is bad for employers, right? We were in a situation where we were talking about, imagine you were an Israeli employer, but also what you mentioned about kind of the mainstream lacking that power lens. I think this is very important, because even in the Palestinian context, you see the mainstream talking about, well, these Palestinian workers, they went to work in Israel because wages were higher. And again, like how you detach completely from the confiscation of land, from how they lost their capital, from what is happening to their communities, to kind of merely talking about this wage issue just shows you how little you can understand with mainstream. In 1987, this is absolutely, there's a very important role for labor. But I think one thing that people don't discuss enough, and while I was doing research, I actually found this in some of the data. In 1987, the economic situation of Palestinians was not the worst that it was compared to other periods before and after. In fact, the unemployment rate in Palestine at that time was one of the lowest. And so this is, I think, important to understand this notion of economic peace, that you can give Palestinians some work, that you can give them some income without talking about national liberation and self-determination and political aspirations, and somehow they're going to shut up, is completely false. So in 1987, what happens is a lot of, obviously, continued settlement expansion is happening. There's a lot of violence that is happening against Palestinians. And so Palestinians revolt, rise. Intifada means uprising. And what happens from a political and economic perspective is that Palestinians decide we are going to stop working in Israel. We are going to stop paying taxes to Israel, and we're going to stop buying Israeli products. And it is really one of the, there are several boycott against the British Zionist movement and the said Israel, but really kind of the most galvanized kind of periods happens in 1987. And at that time, and now it is a little bit different, but at that time, there was really a reliance on Palestinian labor. The Israeli labor market relied on Palestinian labor. There are certain sectors, even until today, the construction sector might be one of the few, but there were several other sectors that were completely reliant on Palestinian labor. And the Israelis early on realized that. So from 1987, they said, all right, we cannot do this. And so the efforts that you've read about in the last year or two of bringing in foreign labor to work in Israel is not something new. In the 1980s, around the first Intifada, this happened, as well as after the second Intifada in 2000. And for a variety of reasons, they were not able, for all of the other reasons that we mentioned, that Palestinian labor is good for Israel. The other reason is Palestinians go and work in Israel, and then they go back home. So you don't have to worry about spending. And you also don't have to worry, and this happened a lot in the last 20 years, you don't have to worry about Israel being this, homogenous, Jewish. I mean, in Tel Aviv, this happened around the 2010, there were demonstrations against Ethiopian and Eritrean workers who are there because they said they were tarnishing the Jewish, the Israeli community. And so Palestinians don't give that problem to the Israelis because they go back, then they also spend money in the Israeli market. And so for a variety of reasons, they were not able to replace Palestinian labor with that from other places around the world.
This is truly fascinating because I think, again, it shows how what happens to the Palestinians is a metaphor of what happens in many other places in the world. And this use of segmenting the labor force so as to ultimately compete for the very few job opportunities is something that heavily shapes, of course, American society and then the xenophobic reactions that we see today. Ibrahim, I think another aspect that really speaks to this global issues that American citizens face every day is this constant commodification of other resources, not just land, but for example, also water, and how Palestine ultimately represents again this ultimate violence of how water is expropriated from the Palestinian people. Our dependence on water as humans is explicitly, and its consequences are brought to the extreme consequences in the Palestinian territories, and especially in Gaza right now, where indeed in the West Bank, the Mekarot company that is state-owned by Israel actually owns all of the water supply. So 80% of water supply of the Palestinian people has to be purchased from the Israeli corporation. And in Gaza, the situation is, of course, much worse. We have, in fact, the fact that World Bank already in 2005 was telling us that there was the supply of water was at crisis levels in Gaza. And in 2020, only 10% of the Gaza population had access to clean water. Of course, what we see today is an escalation of this. But can you tell us a little bit more about water and how it really kind of shows what we've been speaking about more broadly?
Yes, I mean, you're right. Of course, what is happening today is a different level, different magnitude. But I think it's important to talk about this. Palestinians in Gaza were not living the wonderful life before October 2023. And so I think it's important for people to understand that even before the last 2 years, what has been happening is making that land uninhabitable for people and trying to push people economically outside of that land. The magnitude and the level that we see now, the level of violence that we see now is obviously different, and it is a much more direct way of pushing people out. But those economic conditions that were put there to push Palestinians out existed there before. Water is absolutely an integral part of it. You understand, of course, that part of the world is water scarce, and so water is extremely important. But B, as well, right? Palestinians, up until the 1960s, the vast majority of economic activity was agriculture, and water is extremely important for agriculture. And so what happens is, particularly because of the settlements, but not alone, but also because of the settlements, you see this, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was something about like the water apartheid or something like that. There was one of the reports that was talking about this. But what you see then is water taken from Palestinian land, right, to this Israeli company, and then sold back to Palestinians, and then they have to pay the money for the water that they are not allowed. You're not even allowed in certain areas not only to dig for wells, but actually to have, water collecting cisterns. And there's a lot of people who've been doing some interesting work on this. What that meant is you see the discrimination in terms of the consumption of water. So even 20 years ago, right, in 2005, 2006, all the reports were saying that if you look at the consumption of Palestinians, so the World Health Organization normally says 100 liters of water per day, on average for domestic and personal everything use is normally what is recommended, 100 liters per day. What you find is Palestinians, on average, the consumption of water was around 70 liters per day, while Israelis was 240 liters per day. So you're already seeing this in the consumption. Not only are you stealing, plundering the natural resources, not only are you then selling it back, but you are also selling it in the aspect where the vast majority of it is also used either for Israeli settlements or goes to the Israeli market. And so there are a lot of these pictures at that time. Again, there was a lot of interest in this, and you would see these pictures of Palestinians trying to use like drip irrigation for their agriculture, and at the same time showing the swimming pools that the Israeli settlements had on the top of the hills, and kind of showing in picture that bifurcation, if you want, of natural resource use. Absolutely.
Yeah, this man-made drought that we're seeing today, children dying of thirst every day, and we know that it's thirst then brings to complications in terms of even scabies becoming potentially deathly, not to speak about polio and other diseases. This is ultimately the result, what we see today, the ultimate destruction of all of the infrastructure for water in Gaza, is what I think a very good expression of what Francesca Albanese has showed us, how the economy of occupation can easily be transformed into an economy of genocide. Because once you control of these resources, and it's, I think, interesting to note that until 1967, actually water was a common in Palestine. It was not appropriated and privatized and put into the hands of the occupier. So the construction of drought and the construction of famine is ultimately, again, the result of very high market dependence that we see also connected to other energy sources. We know that it's not only water that is controlled by the Israeli occupation, but also electricity, for example, and how ultimately without electricity, there's no way to desalinate water, and how now the blockade that is not letting oil come in, which oil was substituting electricity once electricity was being cut out, but now there's over 100 days of blockade on oil, and how we see again how these dependency that has been constructed over time, and again a long-term process, is escalating right now in the capacity to ultimately destroy the population. And again, I think it's very interesting from us living, in the US, thinking that we can just pretend this is not happening. It's very important for us to understand that this is a possibility in our countries as well. Once we become dependent on these natural resources from these private corporations, or anyway from the profit motive. It's very easy to transform once more this speculation only for profit in destruction. And I think this is something that, especially with the escalation of the climate collapse that we're seeing, we need to keep in mind. Ultimately, Palestine has always been a laboratory. There's this very good book, of course, that we both read, The Palestine Laboratory, of Anthony Loewenstein, that really shows how it is a laboratory for these much more global phenomenon. And again, it's a laboratory exactly because it's actually the expression of these constitutive elements of our capitalist economy. So Ibrahim, keeping on with this historical perspective, how much can we also understand the fact that, for example, in Gaza, already prior to the genocide in 2022, almost half of the population was unemployed, 80% of the population dependent on aid, and 63% of the population was already food insecure. How do we understand this in relation to how ultimately resources are channeled into this country, also with respect to the fiscal system? Because I think what's interesting about the Oslo Accord, again, 1994, a supposed peace agreements, is that they constructed other forms of imposition of dependency and austerity, especially fiscally. Can we discuss this a little bit and the role of the PA?
Absolutely. So you're right? In the early 1990s, there were what were called the Madrid talks, some conversations between the PLO and Israel. In 1993, you had the Oslo Accords. In 1994, what is called the Paris Protocol, which is just an annex to one of the Oslo agreements, kind of dictates the economic relationships. And what it does is two things. On the one hand, what it does is really entrench the already existing dependency. So you still had the dependency on the labor market. You can see this clearly. Whenever there's opportunity to work in Israel, unemployment decreases and vice versa. There's still that dependency on trade. But what happens is there are new forms of dependency. So imagine this, right? The Palestinian Authority comes, and even though under international law, Israel is still responsible for the well-being of the Palestinian people because they are under occupation. But what happens is, de facto, the responsibility of the Palestinian people is now under the Palestinian Authority. So you have the transfer of responsibility, but no transfer of natural resources, no transfer of control over borders, no transfer over economic policies. You're not allowed to have a Palestinian currency. There's a lot of limitation in terms of trade. So what happens is a gap, because while all of that responsibility is now the responsibility of the Palestinian Authority, there's very, very little resources. So I'm in this kind of weird situation where for the, very few times in my life you defend the Palestinian Authority. But that's what happened because now you have this reliance on international aid, a new dependency on international aid with all the problematic aspects that historically international aid has, but specifically in the Palestinian context. Why? Because exactly what you mentioned, Clara, it took politics out of it. And so what it tried to do is kind of try to pacify anything political and think that there's an economic solution for a political issue. The other part is also private debt. So now you have a new dependency on debt, on credit. Why? Because Palestinians are not having any type of solid jobs, and yet they need to have purchasing power and consuming power. And so private debt kind of skyrockets starting from 2006, 2007, including with the changing of some of the regulations that you have there. And so all of this is happening under the Palestinian Authority and with the Paris Protocol. Actually, one of the few good things about the Paris Protocol was the fiscal aspect, what you mentioned. So it actually said that Israel is responsible. And remember, we said the vast majority of trade happens either with or through Israel. So the Paris Protocol says that Israel is responsible for collecting what we call the clearance money, which is kind of, customs taxes, all of these tariff taxes that happen on the border. So because Palestinians do not have access over commercial borders, Israel would collect them. And according to the Paris Protocol, it is required on a monthly basis to transfer those to the Palestinian Authority, taking a 2 or 3% fee because it was taking care of that. This money, this clearance revenue, is the most important resource for the Palestinian Authority fiscally. Today and for the last 20, 30 years, it constitutes around 70 to 80% of tax resources. So the Palestinian Authority doesn't have the majority of taxes from income tax from Palestinians. It gets it through these clearance revenues. So that's a good thing if Palestinians had access to that. But again, that's the problem when you have an agreement between two sides with different power asymmetries, right? So what happens is Israel decides to use this as an economic blackmail tool. So it says whenever the Palestinian Authority or Palestinians or any part of the Palestinian society does something that we don't like, we're going to halt that money coming in. We're going to halt the roughly 700 to 800 million Israeli shekels coming in, so around $250 million coming in every month, because we don't like something the Palestinians are doing. The Palestinians want to go and get membership. We're going to stop it. Palestinians are giving money to the family of Palestinians who are inside prison. We're going to stop giving. Palestinians are giving money to Palestinians in Gaza. We're going to stop giving money to Palestinians. And so what that has done really is suffocated the remaining Palestinian economy in the West Bank, because obviously cannot talk about anything related to an economy in Gaza. But what happens right now is that you really have two quote unquote stable sources of employment in the Palestinian economy since the 1990s. And those were working in the public sector and working in Israel. And it's ironic that these are the stable sources because these are external. Why? The Palestinian Authority, work in the Palestinian Authority, is completely reliant on either international aid or this clearance money, which is obviously not going. So that's why for years, Palestinians every month are being paid 60 or 70% of their salaries if they're working in the public sector. And clearly you see what is happening with Palestinians who are working in Israel. The last 2 years, Palestinians, the majority of them have not been able to reach work in Israel. And so what you see is the unemployment rates reaching now around 40 and more than 40% of unemployment. And so you're absolutely right. You have these dependencies that were entrenched, were codified, if you want, through the Paris Protocol, but you also find new dependencies being created on international aid, on private debt, and on those fiscal transfers that come via Israel.
Thank you, Ibrahim. You really show, I think, how the power to impose dependency is also the power to impose austerity. Because once you cut the faucet of resources, then of course the Palestinian authorities are left with little choice but to ultimately curtail the stipends of teachers and public employees and to ultimately give less to the Palestinian people. Something that, again, I think in the global north, we know very much. I think this historical perspective that we've taken today really helps us go beyond the reductionist and very superficial approaches to the current genocide that we hear, as if it's all a matter of ethnic conflict, of anti-Semitism and like religious rights. It is about economic interests that are deeply connected to the current extermination on this large scale. So we cannot lose sight, I think, of how these interests are bolstered through time. And today, of course, again, the apex of what we're seeing, and once more, Palestine as revealing a fundamental truth about our economy, which is that what is good for people is usually bad for the economy and vice versa. So what we see today is that the logic of profit has prevailed over the logic of need like ever before. And we need to consider the fact that the reason why newspapers don't like to talk about what's happening in Palestine, it's not to protect the Jewish people. It's to protect the corporate profits that come from the global north. We have Francesca Albanese, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on occupied territories, that has now revealed a very important report that just very plainly states what everyone really knows, right? So there's something not particularly new, but she's been caught in the fire because she's saying, listen, there's a network of enablers. It's not just the big arms corporations that are benefiting, and we know that it's 600 billion of revenue of the top arms company today in the world. We have, of course, the stock prices leaping, for example, 77% since October 7, 2023 to today of RTX. Leonardo company, Italian company in my country, 234% increase in the stock price since October 7, 2023. But it's not just them. Whereas there's Alphabet, there's Microsoft, there's the big asset managers like Vanguard and BlackRock, there is Amazon. This is a ecosystem of those who own the means of production invest in the destruction because the destruction is profitable. And I think this is how ultimately I'd like to give the word back to you, Ibra, for the concluding thoughts, is though how I think critical economics can help us dig deeper. And dig deeper in a way that has this empowering effect, even in thinking about current issues, right? We know today that so many more states are finally recognizing the state of Palestine, and we needed the extermination of all these children in order for this to happen, which is for me like something really, really tragic and disgusting. Is like they need to see these pictures of the skeletal children in order to finally recognize what has been happening again for decades. Our conversation today also, I think, helps us, for example, think better about what does it even mean to recognize the state of Palestine if these economic conditions don't shift, if this subjugation is ultimately entrenched in our political economic system. So, Ibrahim, to conclude, a little bit about what you think about this approach and how we can really use it to hopefully really transform this horrendous state of affairs we're living through.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I'll pick up on what you were mentioning about Albanese's report from the economics of occupation to the economics of genocide. I think framing is important. I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of framing. It's not just some sort of academic exercise. I think if you want to understand what is going on now, and if you want to protect yourself from what I call the liberal surprise, framing is important. So what I mean by that a lot of liberals, especially in the US, they're always surprised. They're surprised that there are, fascist tendencies in the US government. They're surprised there's a lot of inequality going all around the world. They're surprised that there's ethnic cleansing and genocide going on in Palestine. But if you understand the framework, if you understand that Israel is a settler colonial state whose aim has always been to push Palestinians out of the land, then you're not surprised. The magnitude of what is going on, the magnitude of genocide, and, as you mentioned, the magnitude of silence that we've seen from those who are in power. I think as much as thinking of recognizing a Palestinian state might be useful, it is not. It is symbolic. Again, like you mentioned, it probably represents the state of the catastrophe that we've reached, to the extent where these people in power have been forced to kind of do a symbolic gesture like this. But again, I think it is important to put things in the framework. We can see, we can read the numbers, we can listen to the stories of what is happening. But in order for us to understand kind of how this fits in the Zionist project that ended up in the state of Israel, it is important to understand the framing of dependency, of settler colonialism. If you want to understand inequality, it's important to understand that capitalism, our economic system, has inequalities, an inherent part of it. And so I think framing is important. The other reason I think framing is important is because it connects to things that we see every day. The so-called plan for Gaza that Trump had was actually based on an economics paper that is very much a mainstream paper that had on its first page the fact that we should think of Gaza without thinking about politics. So everything that we've been talking about putting economics and politics aside, is exactly what that plan is about. And there's a website that discusses this, the Times of Israel. They have reporting on this paper when the first paper was first discussed with the Trump group. It's called The Man with the Plan. And they talk about that plan for Gaza, right? You put Palestinians outside of Gaza. You have a 50-year equity, where you have shareholders buying parts of Gaza, and kind of this discussion, this deeply dehumanizing discussion of Palestinians and of Palestine. This is it's not a reality yet, but this is something that the President of the United States was talking about, and it is built on an economics paper that follows this mainstream approach. So understanding that framework, understanding that today's economics tries to, divide the economic and the political realms is very important to understand the things that exist nowadays and that we see.
This is so crucial, Ibra. It's the spirit of why Free is trying to do what it's doing. We are putting together these public events and these podcasts exactly to say how we think of things can make a difference in practice, right? And ultimately, it's about connecting the dots, as you point out. The thing is that we are meant to think in compartmentalized way, because the way we even train in economics is about dividing, not seeing the greater picture. Why? Because the greater picture is what is scary for the establishment, because it speaks to the truth. It's not a rotten apple. What we see today, actually, I think what is very important is that right now, more than ever, I think people can see what we're saying just because it's so blatantly out there, right? The violence that we're experiencing, this genocide, is again speaking to not an exception, but a heightened degree of what was the norm. And I think this is where the approach that we are trying to, that Ibrahim and I espouse, and that many others also do in critical economics, is really about saying, let's look at these tendencies. Let's actually focus on these tendencies, on this long-term perspective. It's only then that you don't get surprised, as you're pointing out, about what is happening, right? And again, it's not just about a different approach. It's also that these approaches serve the interest of those in power with the money that ultimately are taking care of bringing this genocide all the way through. So more than ever, it's so important to realize that economics has a huge social role to play. It has a role of enabling the plunder, the constant plunder and extraction. And again, I think Trump's plan is just like a very clear manifestation of what this means. It's the same from Ukraine. This is very profitable to continue the war there as well, because Ukraine is going to give up everything it has ultimately at the end of the day. And this is the reconstruction plans. Again, I'm thinking about this because there's another very important macroeconomic report that many famous economists signed, basically doing exactly what you said for this other region, saying, it's really about, look at the economic perspectives that this country has right now. It's completely in debt. What's going to happen? Well, they're going to have to just sell everything to private investors. And this is nothing new, because if you look at what happened with the transition from the Soviet Union to the market economy in the 90s, it's the same exact script, the script of depoliticizing to then enforce the logic of profit over the logic of need is exactly what has happened in the history of capitalism, just with different historical specificities. And so we more than ever need today to call out this type of approaches, but then show, and I think today we did an amazing job in showing how a different approach can be empowering in terms of explaining things in a deeper way that can actually do justice to us as human beings and as thinkers, rather than constantly dehumanize us. I am so grateful for you, Ibrahim, everything you do. I hope you can follow Ibrahim's work, read his paper on the way in which economics is weaponized against Palestine. And I hope that you can follow us on our free channels, Substacks at freeforum.org, and see you very soon. Hi, Shiloh and AJ. I know you were listening in. I wonder what you thought about the conversation and if we want to have a little discussion about it.
Okay, I'll go first. AJ Bird. I'm here from Saskatchewan in Canada, and I'm First Nations individual. I work in climate tech, and what we've noticed with all this talk about climate, we have something called green colonialism happening, and it's happening definitely from a global north into the global south, using that now as a new resource. So much of what you've spoken about really is, it's unfortunately, it's a global situation that impacts oppressed peoples, very often indigenous peoples, more so than anyone. And so, yes, very much very relevant perspective to be able to expand on.
Thank you. Absolutely. I think this is was the purpose, was to try to deprovincialize the conversation about Palestine. It's always looked at specifically as unique because it serves a purpose to see it as unique and exceptional, so that we can silo it out and think that our capitalist economy is all fine except for this problem. But actually, as you point out, the connection between people is global, and these dynamics happen with different historical specificities to so many. And this has been the history of it all, right? If we go back to how the American economy even started, of course, it all started with the expropriation of the land that was a commons from the different tribes and all of the native people.
I just found it really educational and profound in a way because it just gave me a lot of really great understanding of the history that I didn't know before, but also I just really didn't know anything about the history of the economy in Palestine or what's going on there now.
Yeah, and I think this really speaks to the issue, is that these conversations are never on the table. Again, because they are very dangerous and empowering. But it's such a very important lens and, like, perspective. And of course, it's not the only perspective. There's so many other things in this conversation that we couldn't talk about because the time is so limited. But I think the point is that this perspective needs to be at least added on to our other knowledge about that historical specificity. And it's a real shame if people don't realize that how history is told is deeply political, not just economics, but even history itself, right? Like, ultimately, it's the best instrument is to tell the history from the point of view of the winners of the social processes. And this is what the North has always been about. You only tell it from the perspective of the colonizers, so that you, like, erase the subjectivity of and the reality of what's happening. And I think right now the erasure with the genocide, the erasure of also all the culture of the Palestinian people. And we're talking about centennial culture, that one of the oldest cultures in the world, and with such wisdom, it's all erased. All of the universities are torn apart. There's nothing left, no schools. Specifically, the Israeli occupation has been targeting archives, museums, spaces of life and creativity, because that's how you actually erase a population. And so the economic erasure definitely goes together with the erasure of one's identity and one's capacity to tell the story. And I think, of course, we are lucky enough to not be there at the moment, but I think we do have a responsibility to try to tell the story from a point of view that is most uncomfortable from our liberal media right now.
If I could add something that makes me very uncomfortable as not a person that's directly impacted. I mean, I know we're all globally connected, but I continue to be uncomfortable in understanding how do we address this vis-a-vis what's going on with Hamas. And so, I find that there's this line's been blurred between when I'm hearing about Palestine, I, as a discerning thinker, as someone who's a systems challenger and a systems solutions person in my business and in my life, how do we address Hamas? And I think that would help to address how we get past some of the resistance to understanding. And I admit that's my problem.
But you see, this is the point, is that the way we discuss this issue is by targeting and criminalizing Hamas, to the point that they're even trying to say that the reason why these children are starving to death is because of Hamas, which is completely out of control. So you see, again, it's the exceptionalization, the demonization of the problem here, instead of actually having us understand that Hamas itself as a movement was economically funded by actually the Zionists and the United States, because there was a project to segment what was ultimately a movement of national uprising and anti-colonial resistance that was not religious and was much more scarier because it was capable of actually uniting many more people. So even if we look at the history of Hamas, like if we want to look at the history of Al-Qaeda and all these like supposed very bad demons in this world, we understand that they're deeply connected with the political economic world we build, and they've been financed to serve a purpose, serve the purpose of saying it's all the fault of Hamas. It has nothing to do with the long history of occupation and the desire of the liberation of the Palestinian people. Now, as any movement, there are issues, but I also think that this idea of the coverage of this supposed brutality of these leaders, how brutal are leaders? This is why ultimately having Trump in power is so interesting, because it like shows you, well, are we any less brutal? Like, who is the judge of like of morality here? I don't think as Americans we can be the judges of morality of anyone else, given the genocide we are supporting. And this said, of course, you need to complexify, and this is very important, but it's also very important to escape from the fact that ultimately Palestinians deserve it because they support Hamas, right? Which is
no.
not what you're saying, but what I'm saying is that this is ultimately what people think is like, again, it goes back to the original point of the talk, is that why are people poor? Because they deserve it. They don't have the right institutions. Why are Gaza's people like stuck in living hell? Well, because they were supportive of Hamas. You see, like it's the same way of kind of like putting the blame on the weakest, which is exactly the narrative that serves the dominant. And I think we really need to break through this. And I completely agree with you that this conversation would have required a lot more also like understanding the political history of Gaza, and how Hamas was built and who supports it, and ultimately the pros and cons of this organization. And that was something I hope we can do with experts, and I'm definitely not the experts on that topic.
Well, I would say what we have is a fully grown onion today, but onions, as you know, are layers. And so a traditional teaching I was taught by a First Nation elder is that when you look at an onion that has sprouted out of the garden, you have to go back and go through the layers of the onion. And that's the point, why I brought up Hamas is I know I don't know enough. And so I am challenging myself, and I would like to challenge others that we start layering off that onion to really understand how today's onion has grown. And until we do that, we are all to blame for not, for today's problem. And I'm not sure, Shiloh, are you in the United States as well? Okay, yeah. So I'm in Canada, and me looking right now at the United States, I see a lot of, as you say, who are we to judge what's going on, and is the U.S. or even Canada the right people to judge what's happening right now in Palestine? But when we're busy, and this is another First Nations teaching, when you're pointing your finger, there's three more pointing back at you. And so that's also a very important perspective, is that who are we to judge? And if we're going to judge, we best not be living in that proverbial glass house. So, but the whole aspect of economics as a weapon is what's happening here very much. And I think that's what I took first and foremost. Even controlling water. Water is a human right, and it's not there. It's horrible.
I really do think that we have such a duty right now to explore avenues of humanization, and this includes critical knowledge. And I guess Shiloh is a fundamental member of our team in Building Free. And so ultimately, I think this is what is compelling us to move this project on, is really the idea is we feel so powerless. How can we kind of feel just a little bit less powerless, and trying to share what are some tools that hopefully people will take on. And I think it's important that this is, as you say, it's just the first peel of the onion. There's so much more scholarship on the history of Palestine and Israel, and I hope people will take it as an opportunity to dig deeper, and hopefully as Free we can share some resources. Thank you so much for being with us and for listening. It's our first time, so we will improve in everything we do. But yes, this is something so meaningful for me that we're all here together. Thank you.
Thank you. Keep on peeling.